Okay, so the Ally is accessibility tools, and it's not confined to PDF, but it's PDF is one of the focuses.
It's one of the formats, yeah. So we do PDF, Word files, presentations, HTML, images, those kind of things.
From my point of view, greatly simplifying matters. I'm proposing a garbage indirect detector, and and Blackboard has obtained or developed a garbage out detector.
Yeah, so we deal with what's presented to students. So we typically don't really deal with the LaTeX itself. We typically deal with what PDF LaTeX has produced.
Yeah. So in a certain sense, if my tool says the LaTeX is accessible and the resulting PDF is not accessible, then there's a problem in the transformation. You know, that's if I put my clothes into wash and they no longer fit, there's a problem with the washing machine.
Right, but I think what your tool, where the value in your tool would be, is if you can get that feedback in the early stage whilst authors are writing their documents, it's much easier to address accessibility issues rather than afterwards, once they've produced their PDF or once they've stepped away and published it, and then 2 weeks later they need to go back and update their documents. So if your tool does all that accessibility, and then at some point I imagine the PDF LaTeX printer, or I'm not sure what it's called,
renderer,
at some point, renderer, yeah, at some point that thing is going to have to produce tagged PDF, or it's always going to be garbage out. But your tool should at least simplify the job of that thing, because it can start with a set of recommendations that you've built in, like they can add those in. So I do think that this is the right approach. It is the right way forward. But there's still some other steps that need to happen before like it surfaces to us where we deal with less garbage out.
we still need to get the tagging in the PDF, don't we? So that seems to me to be a problem here, in that even if you write a document in LaTeX, which would theoretically be nicely, it should have all the information in to be good accessibility. By the time it's been PDF rendered, it comes out again, and all of that metadata behind it has been lost, if I understand it correctly.
There's a lot of problems involved in tagging.
I know, we keep saying that, yeah.
Yeah, and most of the problems amount to this. LaTeX and TeX weren't designed with that in mind. And actually, of the two, LaTeX is the least flexible, in the sense that it's a big and complicated thing. And so it's not easy to, get the information flow you need. That is, if you like, a separate problem, and it's not the problem I want to do next year.
Well, I think it's fair to say that your thing won't solve all the problems, but it does seem to me like it would address a specific aspect of the workflow. And I think I'm impressed by how kind of reasonable and realistic you are about, because usually at the beginning of a project, people are more utopian or greenfieldy. So I think I'm encouraged that you seem to have a very practical approach in mind. And I think what you're laying out for yourself is achievable. I think if you started messing with the outputs, this would be a very large scope project. It might also be useful if it was looking at outputs, right? It might be a different approach, but it wouldn't really, it wouldn't help with the first part, which is the writing of the thing. But I think that's also useful, right? Because also another thing teachers do is they just share documents around without like, so often these documents will be produced by somebody else. So I think post-processors like Blackboard and stuff is doing is also very useful. But I think that what you're proposing is quite useful. So
in the notes I made for myself prior to this meeting, I had 3 columns: developers, users, and dissemination. And under developers, I wrote Python and JavaScript. JavaScript in some form or the other is what's required for a purely browser-based application, which is in some sense the very best. And if you're using—
in theory, you wouldn't even need it. You could do server side. You could just have people upload the file, and then, in theory, I'm just saying.
yeah. The problem is you then got to run and maintain a server and that sort of thing. But Python is the language that I'm quite familiar with, and a lot of other people are familiar with. So from the developer's point of view, to begin with, Python, because it's the least problematic language in terms of defining what the behavior should be. And then the next thing is users. And how do you get users? And if your software requires a big change in production process, or even a minor change in production process, a lot of resistance, and it requires installation and so forth. Whereas if it's just an extra thing that helps you, a useful tool like a spell checker, an external tool that just sort of helps you a bit, then it's easier to get users. And the final thing is dissemination. And I think that having a focus on the Office of Student Disability Support is a great one for dissemination, because you've got the right target audience there. So that's the way in which I sort of look at things. And that's why, even though there's this big, long demand for tagged PDF, and undoubtedly the absence of tagged PDF is an Achilles heel for tech and LaTeX, is a really big weakness. It's not something that I can very easily contribute to, particularly as I'm not part of the LaTeX team, and in some sense out of sympathy with what they're trying to do. My view is, well, it's going to be painful, but we have to rewrite everything. And their point of view is, well, it's going to be painful, but we don't have any alternative but to keep on the way we're going.
It's a hairball. I mean, the whole LaTeX ecosystem is kind of a hairball at this point. So I think sidestepping it a bit makes sense. And I'll also just say, if you do write a Python, whatever, accessibility linter, whatever you wind up calling it, and it outputs JSON or some machine readable format, I'd be very happy to help you put up a web app, make an API for it, whatever. That kind of thing is more my end of things. But
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's basically what I do, is make web apps and stuff like that. So, and APIs.
Kelly, you're muted.
Yeah, thanks. So I would say that unlike Patrick, I have no web app skills, but mine skills more align with rules and documenting rules. And I think Nelson has probably the best handle on that as far as the number of books that he's shown throughout these talks that have the information. But I think that there's a bit of a gap in having that information be in textbooks versus clickable and on the web. And so I think that translating some of that without making just another, we've talked about this before, about not just making another additional resource that becomes outdated, but my goal would be to document the code for this linter in a way that you transcribe all of those rules that you're taking out of these textbooks that define the code in a readable machine and human way. I can explain that again if needed, but like I said, I can't build web apps, and I don't want to create just one more HTML link that's going to become outdated, but I do believe in documentation. And so trying to make the code documented in a way where someone like me that might not understand the code and what it's doing, but can pick up the documentation really quickly and just learn by example that way, I think is very important. And it's what I like to do.
So one of the things you're saying, Kelly, is that the code base should be open for contributions. Good, you nodded.
And like people with accessibility issues that try to say if the output is garbage, a lot of times they'll go to the input. I think this is the same thing. So somebody like me that I don't have accessibility issues as far as like reading, I have accessibility issues as far as like understanding code. And so sometimes it's easier for me if something is well documented right next to the code, then it helps me learn what that code is doing. And so I really, really champion things that have documentation that's integrated with code.
You're a member of the R community in the sense that you're not a developer and you're somebody who uses R for their work. And you seem to, what's the word? You like being part of the R community. You like using R, Kelly?
Yeah, of the things that I've tried, I would say that I've stuck with R for the longest amount of time. And I try to pick up other things and nothing has been quite as user friendly, I don't think, as far as trying to do statistics and report writing.
Okay, that's great. We normally stop at 7:30, or rather give people a chance to go. And then people can stay on afterwards if they want to. I'd like to offer Simon an opportunity to contribute further if he wants to.
Yeah, of course. As far as your project goes, what I would say is I can see the value in it, but I would suggest to start small. Whenever I've seen other checkers or linters for accessibility, they tend to focus on the very tiny nitty-gritty detail. And I would suggest to start small and to start with a reasonable set of rules that you can reasonably explain to people as well. That was one of the things we struggled with Ally in the beginning. We were, a lot of people, well, I assume the LaTeX community will be a bit better but we were dealing with the wider spectrum of users, and you can't come at them with these fine-grained issues that are in their content. You need to be able to explain it well. You need to be able to offer a reason as to why they need to make these changes. You need to explain why what they have done or what they have is not quite as good as they might have thought, and try and persuade them to be better. I suspect you'll have less of those issues. I think the LaTeX community will be pretty good on that kind of thing. But yeah, those are a few things we struggled with in the beginning to get that balance right.
That's very valuable, Simon, particularly because it sort of comes from a different point of view to the one that I'm accustomed to have. It's more pragmatic and less, I'll use the word theoretical. I sort of see it as an engineering problem rather than a human problem, but actually it's a human problem because everybody involved in it is human.
I'll ask Simon a question while I've got him online, which is if we were to take the LaTeX and translate it to HTML, for which there are a number of translators around, would HTML be more easily said to be accessible by Blackboard Ally?
So I think there's two questions in there. The first one is, would converting to HTML be more accessible in general? And I think yes. I mean, I don't know the state of rendering to HTML, but I would suspect that it's fairly easy to add the necessary tagging, the right semantics, maybe pull in math checks to render the math. I would suspect that is more easily done than the current PDF renderer. So without knowing anything of it, I'm saying yes, going to HTML is probably better. As far as Blackboard Ally, we are currently heavily focused on PDFs because it is such a big problem for people with disabilities or with screen readers. We will score your HTML file and it will probably be much better, or we will score it much better than the equivalent PDF file. So yeah, in both cases, it would be a better end result for the user, I suppose.
Okay, thank you. I may do a few experiments and see what I find out.
Cool.
I have a quick suggestion based on something that Simon said as far as keeping things very small. And Markdown has really gained a lot of traction, and it has less syntax than LaTeX does. But I mean, in the end, it's all translated to LaTeX. So I was curious if potentially we could focus on something that is available in Markdown, and then how that's translated to LaTeX, and then trying to make sure that those rules are the best practice. So not only are you helping LaTeX people, but then you're also helping Markdown people as well. And so if this, if basically a Markdown file is a text file, same as LaTeX. So if you could check both types of files, that would be really great. And Markdown makes it where you have less things to check initially because there's just less functionality there.
I think that's a very sensible suggestion, Kelly. And I in my blog, I put some mathematics in my blog, and the rendering, I changed versions of the blogging engine and found that the mathematics started failing because of multiple escaping conventions not working as they did before. So even for that point of view of a markdown document containing mathematics, will the process read it properly is an issue. And allowing markdown as an input syntax, I think, is eminently sensible. Essentially, that comes down to extracting the mathematics and saying, yes, the mathematics is okay. And I see that as a very simple shortcut to creating an accessible document containing mathematics, which is don't bother about the PDF or do the PDF as an afterthought. I think that if I was asked to create a page of accessible mathematics, I'd make it a web page rather than a PDF. Multiple nodding of heads in favor.
But realistically, people like to write their papers and publish their journal articles and all that. So the PDFs is just something we have to live with, even if they're not as good, right?
Yeah, and I think that if you're going to analyze the LaTeX mathematics in the Markdown and construct a syntax tree from that as part of the process, then it's not much more work to do the whole document because it's not going to be that much harder. But Markdown should be an accepted input format in terms of accessibility checking. I completely agree. And I would also, in the accompanying documentation, make statements of the benefits of using R Markdown as your authoring agent, even if PDF is your primary output. And the biggest argument for that, I think, is what Jonathan Godfrey has said. I don't know if you all know Jonathan Godfrey. Jonathan Godfrey is He comes here occasionally. It's a difficult hour for him because he lives in New Zealand. So he has to get up early in the morning to get to these sessions. But he's a senior lecturer in statistics. He uses the R system, and he's blind. So he's a real expert and a real testimony to the suitability of R markdown for dealing with accessibility questions.